Hello, everybody. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of the Cosmic Centaurs, and your host for the fourth annual edition of the Cosmic Conference. And I'm very excited to have you all with us today. This year, our conference is 5 weeks long, and it's hybrid and in person, and includes sessions in the UAE, KSA, as well as online sessions on LinkedIn Live, just like this one. Our focus this year is all on helping you lead organizations that deliver, and we're exploring this topic through 5 sub-themes, one per week: strategy execution, scaling, and this week, transformation, capability development, and restructuring. From October 6th till November 11th, I am joined by thought leaders and academics to share their insights, knowledge, and perspectives for a total of 11 online sessions and 5 in-person events. All of these are free to attend. We believe in learning in public and learning together with our community. But recently, someone asked how they could thank us for the work. We had to think about it, and now we have an answer. There are 2 ways that you can contribute. The first, if you have a few dollars to spare this month, you can donate to the Cosmic Centaurs Fund, which is dedicated to supporting women re-enter the workforce. And although we are usually supporting people in Lebanon, for this month and the months to come, we will be giving all of the donations to somebody in Gaza to help them potentially return to work. If you don't have money, but you do have time, you can take our Future of Teams survey. We've been running the survey for 3 years in a row in partnership with Dr. Connie Hadley to explore what makes people engaged at work. And we would be incredibly grateful if you took the survey. Both of those links will be dropped in the comments. Now, this week, our theme is transformation. Strategy execution is, in essence, an exercise of change management and transformation. 96% of organizations are in some phase of transformation, but only 1 out of 3 change initiatives actually succeed. And we're here to talk about how leadership influences that. Today's guest is Wissam Adib. He's an executive coach and organizational behavior expert. He leverages a 25-year career leading large and small-scale organizational transformation programs and works with these leaders to unlock hidden potential and create transformative results. This included several turnaround and restructuring projects, as well as leading the institutional reform of several Dubai government authorities. Wissam delivered a keynote at the opening event of our conference. Our team will drop a link to that video if you wanted to watch it. And we are delighted to have him back again for another session. Wissam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Marilyn. It's a pleasure to be here.
We got so much incredible feedback about your session in the keynote, in the opening event, and I'm sure that today's session will not be any different. Today, we will be discussing how one can adapt their leadership to the phases of change. According to a lot of research, organizational leaders are the ones that employees look to during change for direction, support, and cues on where they need to direct their efforts. At Cosmic Centaurs, we always say leaders don't need to endorse change. They need to engage in it and manage it actively. And today, you'll be telling us all about the various phases of change and how leaders can adapt their leadership style during those phases. Without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Marilyn. Yeah, and I think it's great what you said, that, leadership is about driving the right behavior out of people. So it's very much a people job. And today I just prepared a very quick kind of presentation, a very quick keynote about how do we manage change and how do we ensure that we understand what are the phases of change and what are the different types of leadership that are required. And one of the fundamental kind of distinctions that leaders need to make during change is change versus transition. And the distinction is that change is situational. It's what's happening on the ground. When you bring your consulting team on board or you have a change program that you're rolling out, this is what we call about change. What are the steps? What's happening in your organization? But there's something that's also taking place below the surface, and we call that transition. So transition is very much psychological. What are people going through? What are they feeling? What's the experience of change? And this is where many change programs get stuck. The famous kind of anecdotal statistic that 70% of change programs fail really comes down to how well do you manage transitions. And while these can take place in parallel, they don't always align completely. So, change is about moving from the current situation to a future state through some kind of change program that you're running in your organization. But transitions are different. Transitions are about endings, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, kind of the three phases of transitions. But what's ending for employees in your organization? As they go through kind of this middle bit called the neutral zone, what's the experience of figuring out who they need to be to exist in the future? And then finally, they emerge kind of into new beginnings. And on the slide here, I've kind of lined them up, but they don't always line up this way. Sometimes people can experience endings before a change program begins. And sometimes the change program begins and endings only happen later. So, one of the things maybe we can talk about later is how do you figure out, what are the signals that you've gone through these different phases. And this is really, I think, where leadership needs to come in. You can delegate a lot of the situational stuff, a lot of the change stuff, but it's very difficult to delegate the psychological bit. So what are the phases of change? Endings are about letting go of the past to make way for the new. When an organization is going through a change, people sometimes go through a grieving process where they're mourning the organization that they've been a part of for so many years. So there's a letting go. And this is really important because it's so common for people to just ignore endings. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But people want to jump straight into kind of the future state. But it's really important to acknowledge that there's an ending taking place, to respect that period before you move on. And then once you've kind of let go of the past, there's this period in between called the neutral zone. And this period in between is where the old is no longer, but the new has not yet come to be. And this is a period of intense experimentation, of innovation, of people trying out different things, trying to engage with this change, trying to figure it out. But it's also a period of low productivity, and it's a period where lots of mistakes are taking place. So how do you lead during the neutral zone? That's something we'll look at. And then eventually, as people figure things out, and hopefully the leader has done their job well, we emerge into a new beginning. So this is a period of renewed commitment and motivation kind of for the new state to where we want the organization to be going forward. Okay, so let's look at those one by one. Let's kind of open each of those phases up and look at what does it look like and what kind of leadership do we need for each one of those. But before we do that, I want to talk about kind of the seniority, the experience of the different levels of seniority in organizations. And one thing that I'm sure, Marilyn, you've heard many times before on lots of projects that you've worked on is leaders who say, I don't understand why people aren't already bought into this change. And the research shows that actually change, if you look at this kind of very simplistic chart where the y-axis is the level of seniority and the x-axis is kind of time as we progress through change, leaders are already thinking about a future state, right? They're planning for this. They're the ones who have this vision, especially if they've been brought in as new leaders to create that change. They're already living in the future. So they're already kind of in the new beginning phase. As you go down the organization, maybe the people directly reporting to them are kind of already trying to figure things out. They're in the neutral zone, but then the rest of the organization is still in a period of ending. And as you move forward in this transition, more and more people enter the neutral zone, and then more and more people emerge into new beginnings. And this is really important to understand that not everybody in the organization is in the same phase of transition. So, okay, so let's look at each one of those. So what are endings about? So endings are, the experience of endings is an experience of loss. We've lost something that we've always had. It's an experience of grieving. We got used to the organization being a certain way, and now it's not that way anymore. It's very much a grieving process. It's like losing someone. You're familiar to going to work and working with certain people, doing certain things, and now that's no longer the case. And one thing that leaders should really be expecting is an overreaction. And overreactions are reactions by people that logically, rationally don't make a lot of sense. People are, they appear to be more upset than the situation calls for. So how do you deal with that as a leader? Unfortunately, what many leaders do is they become defensive. They start arguing back about why the change is important. This period is not about logic. It's not about trying to explain things out. It's really about acknowledging what's being lost. So think about who's losing what. What are people really losing? Acknowledge that loss. Yes, you know, there is a real loss that's happening, but that loss is necessary in order to make way for something new. Expect the overreaction. Don't get defensive as a leader. Expect that people will overreact. Try to absorb that overreaction. It's really important in this phase to be present, to over communicate. Just like when we're consoling someone who's grieving a loss, we also need to be present for people in the organization to make them feel that we're present, we're listening, we're hearing them, we're communicating about the need for this change, but in a way that's empathetic. One thing that's really important whenever you're undergoing change is to treat the past with respect. This is really important. What you don't want to do is to paint the past as bad and the future as good. You don't want to enter this kind of binary state where things are horrible and we're going to move to this utopia, but in the future, you want to treat the past with respect. And one thing you can do as you notice that people are kind of getting to terms with the grieving process is to mark the ending. So maybe you can have some kind of event. Maybe you can have even something symbolic that says, okay, let's bid farewell to this wonderful thing, wonderful organization that we've been in for so many years, and let's get ready to move forward. I'll give you a quick example, Marilyn. I'm sure you'll have more questions for me later. But one thing that I've done many times in the public sector on programs where we try to introduce change to overcome bureaucracy, where we overcome rigidity in the public sector, is in situations where where I've gone and I said, bureaucracy is bad and we need to move to greater agility. That really hasn't landed very well. What's much more effective is to say, bureaucracy is great. Bureaucracy ensures that government continues to operate. Bureaucracy ensures that there's sustainability, that when you go apply for your passport, you're going to get it, a week later. But we need to create room for agility as well to exist next to bureaucracy. So it's really about that, respecting the past, acknowledging that the people's lived experience of the past is something that they used to look forward to going to work to every day. So that's the ending. So once we kind of go through that grieving process, that mourning process, the leadership approach is about absorbing that, empathizing with that. We move. What you'll notice is that grieving tends to gradually die down, and it makes a room for this new phase called the neutral zone. And the neutral zone is an interesting period because it's a period of low motivation, because we've let go of something, but we're not yet exactly sure where we're headed next. It's a period of low productivity. A lot of people are telling us to do things differently, and we're figuring them out. Maybe we have a new system that we need to figure out. Maybe we have a new technology platform. Maybe we're reporting to a different person in the organization than we did before. We're working with different people. So everybody is kind of figuring each other out. One thing that a professor of mine, an example that he always used, is people are like hedgehogs, right? They're a little bit spiky, and whenever they get too close to each other, they poke each other. And we're trying to figure out the right configuration where we're close enough to get work done, but not so close that we're not getting in each other's way. In the neutral zone, unfortunately, bad things get worse. So if you've got a really bad system in your organization, that's going to get worse. If your customer service is bad, it's going to get worse. And there's high polarization. What I mean by polarization is lots of people in the organization are going to be thinking, this is terrible, I completely disagree with the change program, I want to go back to the way things were. And then you've got lots of other people in the organization that are saying, this is super exciting, I can't wait to move towards new beginnings. So, okay, some bad news, but also some great news. The organization is no longer frozen, it's liquid now, things are moving around. So this is the perfect time for creativity and innovation. This is the time where you really want to be empowering people and asking them to think differently about a lot of the things that they're doing, to try to innovate, try different things, try new things. Everything is up in the air, so it's the time to implement novelty. So what's the leadership approach during this phase? And this phase, by the way, can go on for several months. It can even go on if it's a big organizational restructuring. It can go on for a couple of years. And I've worked in restructuring programs where that's gone on for 2-3 years sometimes. So what do we do here? This is the opportunity for change, as I mentioned. You want to create scaffolding in the neutral zone. What I mean by scaffolding is you want to create these temporary structures that allow people to engage with the change and feel protected, feel supported throughout the change. So it's things like, the typical one that every consulting firm will bring is the kind of a transition office or a transition committee that oversees the change. But it's also things like, what are the rules that you have in your organization now that are blocking creativity? Try to eliminate those. They might have made sense in the past where you wanted people to follow a certain process, but now you want to relax some of those rules. What are the roles that can provide support? I mentioned already transition offices, but another great role throughout the neutral zone is change champions. Having people throughout the organizations that are able to listen to what teams are saying and to be able to respond and able to provide feedback also to the transition office about what's happening. You want to update your performance targets. Focus on much shorter term targets rather than very long-term targets. And reduce your expectations of output. You want to create space for people to experiment and innovate. And if you're pushing them really hard to deliver at a time when they're working with new people, working with new systems, doing things differently, it's really going to become overwhelming and stressful for them. And you want to build capability. So as you're asking people to engage in a new way going forward, what are the capabilities they need? What kind of training they need? So having a good understanding of what are the new kind of skills that we want people to have can really help them feel much more comfortable with the change. So we go through this neutral zone and it goes on for a while and things are chaotic for a while. And the leadership approach here is about embracing uncertainty. So you want to tolerate failure, you want to tolerate mistakes, you want to encourage risk-taking, all within limits, of course, and all within boundaries, but that's the kind of approach. It's a different kind of approach. And over time, what you'll find is things start settling down. People start getting into a rhythm after a while. Things become a little bit more routine after a while, and that's usually a sign that we're emerging into new beginnings. And that's the first word I have there on the list of new beginnings. It's emergent. You can't force it. You can force the end of the change program, but you can't force new beginnings. You'll notice it when it happens. And what happens in new beginnings is there'll be, again, a focus on acceleration. People will get used to working together in a new way. They get used to working in this new system, and now we're focusing and we're accelerating towards our goals. We have new routines, and we're making fewer mistakes. So you nurture this. Once you notice that new beginnings are starting, you nurture it. You nurture it by continuously explaining the purpose of the outcome that you're seeing, by painting a picture of what you want the future to look like. You don't want to paint a picture during the neutral zone because that picture is not clear yet. People are figuring it out. But once you start seeing what picture is emerging, then you can paint a clearer picture of where you want to go next. And then, give each person a part to play in this new beginning. During the kind of this period where you're emerging into new beginnings, it's really important to be consistent in messaging and action. So you don't want to be, for example, preaching teamwork and then rewarding individual contribution. You don't want to be talking about innovation and then force people to follow rules very strictly. You don't want to be talking about taking risks and innovating and then punishing mistakes. So it's really important to be consistent in what you say and then the behavior that you follow as a leader. You want to be celebrating quick wins here. People have been working so hard, so long, with a lot of uncertainty, hopefully with a lot of support from the leadership, but they want to start to feel like it's been worth it, like we've done something that's been really worthwhile. So take every opportunity to celebrate wins, no matter how small. Celebrate success. As you emerge more and more into new beginnings, then you can shift the focus from risk-taking, innovation, and experimentation towards, again, back to productivity and quality. So this is where you tend to notice that innovation will fall, but productivity will rise, and things will become rigid again in the organization. And as a leader, towards kind of the tail end of the new beginning, you refocus back on higher output and longer term planning. So here, we understand what the organization looks like, and we can focus again on kind of the future. So that's a very kind of brief overview of the three phases of transition. Like I said, transitions don't always align one-on-one with the change programs. So you want to have a way to sense in which phase of the transition you're in as a leader and adapt your leadership style to the different phases.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. We have lots of questions waiting for you. I was organizing them while you were speaking. Nabil, Hadil, Mona, Matt, Lama, just to name a few. And I have a few questions for you too. I think I'm gonna just take this this slide off so that we can have a more natural conversation around this. I tried to still organize some of these questions to cover the different phases, but also some of them are a bit general. Maybe we can just start by talking about that ending piece. Actually, I find it really interesting that you call them, you know, ending, neutral zone, and new beginnings. In the framework that we use, we call them unfreeze, change, and refreeze. I think they all refer to the same things, but also the words that we choose are always very interesting. So I do have questions for you about those wordings later. But Nabil asks, what kind of frameworks or research does this rely on? Like, how do we know that these are the different phases? What demonstrates that to us?
That's a great question, and I'm more than happy to share kind of additional research on this. But this relies very much kind of an understanding of individual psychology as well as collective psychology. So there was a lot of research done in the 60s around taking the study of psychology and applying it on businesses and organizations. And they found that this works on three levels. So there's research around the individual experience of going through change and how that relates to experiences from their childhood, things called transference, for example, how they translate, what they learned in childhood in the organization, the relationship between the individual and the leader, which in many ways replicates the relationship between the individual and the parent figure as children. So that's why there's kind of this strong subconscious component. But then the second layer is the psychology of teams, how teams come together and work, and then kind of the psychology of organizations. And this concept of the collective unconscious, primary task, primary risk. So how do organizations come together to perform, and what is seen, but what is unseen as well, what is sometimes lurking just below the surface that can impact a lot of these change programs. So there's a big body of work around kind of organizational psychodynamics and psychology that this work is built on.
Nicely done. We have a couple of questions here about how do we measure when a phase begins and another one ends? We have that question from Hadil, from Maya. I also had written it down as one of my own questions.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of it is experience. It's about watching out for those indicators of, we know the grieving process, what it looks like for individuals, the 5 steps of grieving: denial, negotiation, and then eventually acceptance, right? And you're moving on. And you'll see the same thing in organizations. At first, they'll be like, we don't need this change. This is unnecessary. We're fine. And then it's about negotiation. Do we really need this change? And then gradually kind of fall into acceptance. Okay, fine, we're ready to move forward. So it's about having the empathy as a leader to understand when the ending is over and people are starting to become receptive to ideas about how things might be going forward. And then as you go through the transition, it's about, you'll experience a lot of uncertainty again. So it's about noticing that there's so much uncertainty. And really, as a leader, you want to continue to allow that uncertainty to exist. One tendency we have is as leaders, we want to move towards certainty. We want things to be clear again. Yeah. So we're constantly solving problems. So you want to take a step back and say, okay, let people solve the problems, continue to nurture that uncertainty. And then you'll notice new signals emerge around people feeling much more confident and becoming less receptive to change towards the end of the neutral zone. And noticing those things is about having empathy as a leader. A lot of it is also about having experience. Once you've gone through these a couple of times, you start to pick up, okay, this is what's happening now. We're emerging again. And then you can adapt your approach.
you develop an instinct around the signs that you can read.
Yes.
Mona made a comment about the need for leaders to engage really early. She mentioned an example where, as an external consultant, she was leading a workshop one day, and someone in that room that worked for a semi-government organization just burst into tears, explaining that while there are consultants walking in and out of the room, leaders haven't actually bothered to engage with them in meaningful ways. Talk to us about, well, let's get tactical here. What does a leader engaging actually mean?
Yeah, and what it means, again, is dependent on the phase of the transition you're in. That's a very complex question. And what engagement means is an understanding that there's a deeper relationship between the leader and the employees than a purely transactional one. That people actually derive meaning and they derive a sense of identity and purpose by working for a certain leader or with a certain leader. And when, to the point, I think you said Mona, her name was, the
Yes.
point she made was that, if it's only consultants in the room, that really feels like a sense of abandonment. Like, imagine if a parent figure were to abandon you in your moment of need, in your moment where everything is changing and you're completely insecure about the future. That's kind of what it feels like for people. And I think leaders often overlook that because they're so focused internally, they're so focused on kind of the mechanics of the organization that they forget that there's this unconscious link. So at the beginning, lots of empathy, lots of understanding, lots of listening, lots of being present, being there, understanding that as a leader, you might be the target for a lot of that anxiety and a lot of that fear. People want to blame somebody for it. And it's okay. Allow yourself to be that target, absorb that anxiety, absorb that fear, and recognize that it's not really, targeted at you. You're just a container for it because you happen to be the person who's calling the shots. And in fact, what will happen is as you absorb more and more and more of that fear and anxiety, you'll notice that people become present again, they'll become conscious again, and they'll see you, and they will, in fact, appreciate that you were there for them when they were blaming you, that you were able to have that presence and ability to absorb all of that anxiety, and they will become much more cooperative afterwards.
Yeah, I really love that. I think tactically it means very simple things that we forget to do, right? Like, as leaders, we walk into the office or wherever we are, we have all these meetings, we're being called into different places, we're making a lot of different decisions. And in fact, what engaging means can be very simple things. It can be making sure that every day you ask somebody for feedback about the process, that you take 30 minutes to hear somebody, as you say, complain, even if that's not going to change the outcome. Like, even if in the end you'll say, I've heard you. Here's one thing we might do differently, but in the end, we're still going to have to go through this together.
Yeah.
Just that presence, just dedicating 30 minutes, 40 minutes to this per day to make sure that this change is taking place. And a lot of it is facilitating communication, either listening or speaking or both, facilitating decision-making, explaining the why. I don't think it's rocket science. I just think, I say this a lot. When we look at, like, as leaders, for example, me as the leader of my business, I'm constantly aware of our P&L, right? I know how much money we're making. I know how much money we're losing. I constantly make decisions around business development and sales, and I spend my time doing these things. What often could happen is you just forget to spend another 30 minutes on your people because your day just went by and you're tired by the end of it. And I think it's simple things like that that matter and that people really resonate with. It doesn't have to be some grand, complex, communication plan. It can just be being present and making time.
And that's such an important point, Marilyn. I mean, it's really important to make space for this kind of stuff, to be present, to be able to allow people to see you, to communicate with you, to talk to you, to genuinely listen. We have a tendency to listen with the aim of changing, right? I listen to what you're saying so that I can respond and convince you of what I want you to think. And there's a time and place for that. not early on in the process. Early on in the process, it's just about listening, understanding where people's mindset is at, what are they thinking about, because that also really helps you shape your narrative. When you talk about your change story, when you talk about why we need to move in a certain direction, collecting all of that feedback and really listening deeply to what people are saying to you can help you take them from where they are to where you want them to be. And again, it's really about acknowledging the current state. It's not about denying where they are now. It's about saying, yes, you're right. It is pretty scary right now where we're at, but we've got a great plan about where we want to go forward. And I have every confidence that we're going to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question here from Matt about what are the key skills that organizations lack in order to be able to deliver change more effectively? Like if you could magically take a wand and give organizations either skills or specific roles or people within the organization to help with change management, what are the, I don't know, the 3 skills you would magically grant them?
I don't know if there are 3 skills, but I could maybe summarize it in the ability to communicate effectively across the whole organization. So within teams, across teams, within different layers of the organization. What tends to happen with organizations that perform really well and really efficiently is that we avoid unnecessary communication. So once we've done things a certain way a few times, it becomes a policy, it becomes a process. So then everybody knows what they need to do. So we stop negotiating all those things, right? It becomes automatic. And over time, what tends to happen is we just kind of go with the flow of things. We figure out how things happen, and things happen really quickly. And change is about slowing down. And that's, if you're not used to that, that feels like we're wasting time. It feels like we're not doing anything. So a really important skill in organizations is how can we nurture spaces for unstructured communication? Even as we have our processes and policies, and even as we're running really quickly to deliver certain things, do we have space where it's just open dialogue, where we're just listening and talking and acknowledging each other and coming up with new ideas? Innovation is an approach that can really help prepare organizations for change. If you have processes in place that can identify new ideas, create space for them to grow, nurture them, invest in them, develop them, give people space to work on things that are not necessarily within their core mandate, then that can become a nice segue towards later on having the skills for a change process, because you're already used to talking and listening and working on things that are not necessarily clearly spelled out. And then once you're going through the change, you just kind of expand that space because more and more of the organization is undergoing innovation.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. You talk about, in your answer now, you talk about change as a slower process. In fact, earlier you mentioned that even in that neutral zone, things get worse before they get better. I experienced that as well as a consultant. I always try to prepare my leaders for this. And I tell them, I'm like, by the way, halfway through this, you're going to want to fire me because you're going to think that I've messed up your organization. And actually figure, we call this the valley of despair, right? Like there's a moment where we go through that valley and we don't think we're ever emerging from it. You mentioned kind of patience and the ability to keep, plowing forward. Is there any other advice that you give to leaders in that moment, in the moment of like when things really get worse, they get broken?
And it's precisely in that valley of despair where the value of the leader is so important. You need someone who's going to say, no matter how bad it looks, I know we're going to emerge from this. I can see the goal. For someone to continue holding that vision clearly in front of everyone, not the how we're going to get there. You want to leave the how for people to figure out. You can set maybe some broad milestones, but the how people will figure out. But the fact that there is a destination that we're headed toward, there's somewhere there where we want to go, and that I'm confident we're going to get there. And this is where experience can be really helpful. Having gone through this kind of process before, and knowing that despite the chaos, all the elements are going to line up in the end. Somehow they're going to find a way to line up. And if you've gone through that process once before, then you have that confidence, and people really need that energy. They can feed off of that energy and say, oh, okay, if they're sure we can make it, If my leader is sure we're going to make it, then I'll find a way to make it happen as well.
Yeah, one of my mentors, Prof. Joe Santos, he taught this in one of our classes like 7 years ago, and I'll never forget it, where he was saying that the role of a manager is to create certainty in a very uncertain world so people can focus on doing their job, right? It's by creating that bubble of certainty at some point. Like saying, I know it sounds messy right now, but I see the end. That's a form of certainty that allows people to go like, oh, okay, we're going to get out of this, right? I trust this person, they'll make it happen. Now, I think that's a lot of burden, on leaders. They have to be different roles to different people. They have to detect the phases of change. They have to be sensitive to them. They have to then change their leadership style accordingly. They have to go from breaking bureaucracy to allowing innovation to then restructuring things. It's a lot to go through as a single person.
It is.
Is it possible for a single leader to manage all these phases? And who should they partner with? You're a coach, I'm a consultant, but what's your perspective on who is the right partner in that moment to support leaders through that transition?
Yeah. So you're asking two questions. Is it possible, and who do they partner with? It is possible. It does take a lot of work, a lot of self-awareness to be able to play all those different roles. Because as a leader, and anybody who's been in a leadership position, who's gone through a change, will know what the experience feels like when everybody's blaming you. And all you want to do is to kind of throw it back at them. Understanding how you react to people, how you react to those situations, and understanding which part of it is real and which part of it is imagined. So you can kind of filter out the signal from the noise in order to respond. That's a really important skill. So if you've built up that self-awareness, if you've built up that skill set, then that'll serve you really well and allow you to adapt to the different phases. Who should you partner with? At the risk of being self-serving, you should partner with a great coach, right? Because or someone in the organization who's not afraid to speak truth to power, who's not afraid to speak up to you and tell you what they see. Because one thing that great coaches and great kind of advisors do is they can hold up a mirror to what's happening. One thing we talked about during the keynote, if you remember, Marilyn, is this idea that we all see a distorted version of reality, that none of us actually sees what's out there. We see the world filtered through our own lenses, our own experiences. And to the extent that you have someone in your life who can say to you, actually, this is not what's happening. This is what I think is happening. And to the extent that they can also call out your own behavior where it might be dysfunctional or it might not be serving the goals of the change, of the transition, that will give you that data to course correct along the way. Because, let's be realistic. There's no kind of ideal path through change. You're constantly figuring out what's happening and then adjusting as you go along. So you want somebody who can help you collect that data and to help you craft that journey.
Yeah, I'm not self-serving because I'm not a coach, but there are many situations, and my clients will confirm that if they're on this call or listening to us, where I've nagged at them for months to say, I'm kind of operating as a inexperienced coach right here, in this process, but I won't be here forever as a consultant. And you really need someone who's going to hold your hand through this process, because it's going to get violent for you and it's going to get hard, and you're going to have to unlearn so many of your own behaviors. And I'm not the one who can do this with you on the long run. A coach is. So I really believe in that partnership. I've had a coach for 7 years, has helped me go through all of my transitions. I think it really matters. And I think this leads up to a question, also from the audience. I think it's Nabil, Nabil, who asks, and it is a good question to ask, honestly. What is the role of HR in managing change? What is the role of internal comms? We have all these functions that sometimes we default to either saying, oh, it's your problem, or we also default to saying, please stay out of this. Just do payroll, How do you see the role of these functions in supporting the change process?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Marilyn. And it's really building up the capability. And if you have the capacity to do that before you start the change program, that's also great. Building up the capability for those functions to play a more strategic role. Unfortunately, very often HR does tend to default to kind of payroll and more transactional functions. But to the extent that HR can have a process or a mechanism by which they can hear what people are talking about, what are the issues people are having? How trusted are they by the organization? How comfortable are employees going to HR and voicing concerns? And how skilled is HR in filtering all those messages to figure out what's really happening and what's just people feeling anxious about the change?
Yeah.
So they can support leadership in crafting the appropriate messages. Communication is really important because you want to align the communication that HR might be creating internally with the communication that goes out also externally, because people are watching the news, they're reading their news about their organization. I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day who works with one of the big tech firms. Tech has gone through several rounds of layoffs now, and he survived the layoffs. And I was saying to him, "How do you feel? What's going on?" And he said, "I feel terrible." I said, "But you survived. You're still working there." He said, "But this idea that there's loyalty, that we have a job." He's been with the organization for more than 10 years, has been shattered. And so I don't know if I belong there anymore. This doesn't feel familiar to me anymore, this organization. And nothing had changed to him day to day, but everything had changed because the idea he had of this organization in his mind was no longer there. So understanding that, being able to have people in place who can collect that data, collect that feedback, and be able to respond to it is really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, you were mentioning this earlier. I do have a couple of friends who relate to me that they found out about layoffs in their organizations through the news before it was communicated officially internally, which is just earth-shattering, right? Because you, as you say, you believe that you have this relationship. You've dedicated so many years of your lives to this relationship, and suddenly the person in front of you essentially doesn't even break up with you by text. They break up with you by announcing this to somebody else, who then gives you that piece of
They tell their
information.
friends that they're breaking up with you.
Exactly. And I think, to the point of HR, like I've certainly been a leader who sometimes gets frustrated, with HR, where I feel like they just want to be the voice of the individuals coming to them, which is beautiful and it is part of their role. But when HR doesn't mitigate and doesn't support and doesn't act as that first layer of reason to say, like, okay, Marilyn, who's coming to me to complain about something, you're right about this, but you're wrong about that. And this thing that you're right about, I am going to take it and I will come back to you about like how we're going to deal with it. But I want you to reconsider these other things you're complaining about through this lens. Like I think HR sometimes just becomes a vessel to transmit complaints as opposed to an active leader in the change management process. And I also don't get me wrong, like I'm not trying to lay this on other people. I do think, most of the burden lays on leaders, but I also often talk about this, as a leader of a small organization who is very, open and kind of very raw with her team. I say this to them all the time. Like what we also often forget is that leaders are going through a really tough time right now. Like you think you're going through a tough time. Let's talk about these people who are being battered by everybody, even though they see and they have ambition towards the future, even though, they get paid a little bit more than you to manage this, it's still a tough process. And I think having empathy towards leaders is a big piece, but also I think individuals taking ownership of, well, I am here in this company. I didn't quit. I didn't start looking for another job. But sitting here and just being upset about what's happening is also not the right attitude. So I wondered if you had a moment to coach individuals in organizations that are going through change, not leaders, what would be your advice, your approach? What would you say to them?
Well, I'll tell you what I'll say to them, but I'll tell you one other thing. Nobody's going to feel empathy for the leader. So
I
if you're waiting for people to feel empathy for you, it's not going to happen, unfortunately. That's the reality of how these organizations are structured. If I were coaching somebody within the organization, one thing I would really help them with is to figure out how much of their fear and anxiety is real and how much of it is imagined. Because actually, once you peel back all the layers, you discover that people are much more powerful and much more empowered to change their situation than they feel in that moment of change. So it's really about helping staff understand that, yes, it is scary, it does feel scary, it does feel like everything is changing, but actually a lot of what you're feeling is imagined. I'm not suggesting that it's not real, but it's a kernel of truth that you then pile on a lot of your insecurities on top of. So I think a lot of it is helping people figure out how much power they really have to support the change in the organization and to work towards a successful outcome.
Yeah, not least of which is the power to speak up, but also the power to make change at their level and ask for forgiveness, not permission. Like, I think all of these things are within their power. They have a choice. And when they relinquish that choice, they are giving up their power. It's not a passive process. And I really spend a lot of time with individuals who are just individual contributors, trying to push them towards that, to help them realize how much power they do have, in fact. With that, Wissam, we're coming to...
thing I can mention, because you did mention about the role of HR and responding to individuals. You know, HR's ability to respond and deal with people depends a lot on how empowered they are by the leadership, the senior leadership. You know, how much do you trust your HR team? And to what extent do you allow them to guide your transition management strategy?
Did you brief them on the strategy? To start, do they even know what the strategy is? You know, sometimes they're not brought into the room. They're just...
So if HR is part of that conversation, if they're also playing a strategic role in shaping the strategy, the transition strategy, then they feel also much more engaged in terms of transmitting that strategy down to the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if not for 100% of organizations, but for most of organizations, we need to stop thinking of HR as a support function, because in fact, they are the ones managing the most important asset of that organization, right? Beyond kind of manufacturing plants and kind of physical assets. The people are those who walk out the door every night, and they have a choice not to come back tomorrow. And HR manages that asset. And if we keep thinking of them as support functions, we're essentially saying our people are a secondary problem. And with that, Wissam, I want to take us to our rapid fire questions, which we ask every single speaker in the conference to answer with either one word or a very short answer. And the first one is, great strategy is ...
I think great strategy is dialogue. I'm a firm believer that great planning is much more important than great plans because it uncovers so much in the organization. So I think great strategy is not a document that you prepare in kind of behind closed doors. It's something that creates space for people to talk to each other, to set the future direction together. Sure, driven by a vision of a leader, but still, it's about encouraging open dialogue in the organization.
I love that. If there was a hallmark for corporate cards, I think great planning is more important than great plans would make it on one of those cards. It's such a great sentence. Thank you for that. The next question is, what do you think is the one leadership quality that is most needed to improve an organization's ability to deliver on its strategy?
Again, as a coach, the number one leadership quality that I try to build in all my clients is know thyself. Know yourself, know what makes you tick, know how you see the world, know what drives you, what scares you, know what distortions exist in your own lens, because that's going to help you figure out what to do in different situations, instead of just falling back on the same behavior time and time again. It helps you become much more adaptive, helps you tailor your approach to what's needed.
Yeah, I cannot tell you how many times I've told a team member, by the way, I'm pretty sure I'm saying this because of my fear of abandonment, but this is how this is making me feel. You know? And I'm sure they think I'm insane for bringing up my father issues into the conversation, but they are sitting right there with us in the room, so we might bring them up, you know. And then lastly, what is the one book about strategy or strategy execution that every leader should read?
Well, since we're talking about change and transitions, I recommend a book called Managing Transitions by William Bridges. It goes deeper into the topic of transitions and the different roles that leaders can play at different phases.
Beautiful. I didn't know about this one. I shall get it. Thank you so much for joining us, Wissam, and
Great.
for
It was nice being here.
incredible insights and much to think about. And of course, thanks to everybody who attended, who asked us questions. It was really wonderful to have you as part of our audience. The video will be available on my channel, on Wissam's channel, on our website, on our YouTubes, for you to rewatch and share. All of the sessions are, as I said, free to attend. But if you do have some money to give back this month, you can donate to the Cosmic Centaurs Fund that supports women to re-enter the workforce. Or if you have some time to donate, you can take our 15-minute Future of Teams survey. Both links are in the comments. Please subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media so you can join us for our next sessions. Speaking of which, our upcoming session, we have 2 of them. So tomorrow we have an in-person session. If you still have time to sign up, between 9 and 11:30 in the morning. That's in person in Dubai. And then later this week on Thursday, October 26th at 4:30 p.m. Dubai time, we'll be joined by Belen Sentebri to talk about leading systemic change. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and see you soon.